So, Deepak, one of the first questions that I wanted to ask you is, were you aware that suicide and mental health was really an issue over time, over your life experience in the consciousness movement and in the movement of bringing awareness to well-being on all levels? Has mental health always been an issue, or are these times really pressing it in an acute way?
To answer your question, yes, I've always been aware of the magnitude of suicide and depression and the pervasiveness of severe anxiety and its connection to physical disease as well, because of my profession, which is I'm a physician. I've also seen suicide. I remember as a child, one of my father's best friends committed suicide, and we were totally unaware that he was even at risk. He was a very lively, jolly person. I witnessed suicide in medical school with medical school friends, boys and girls in my class, actually, and in other classes, medical school pressure, etc. As a physician, I saw it all the time. And people were brought to the emergency room with suicidal attempts. So, as part of my life as a doctor, I was reminded of suicide, depression all the time. But I had a medical approach to it, and I still do. So, as my training was, there are many causes of suicide. There are situations that cause suicide. There are family circumstances that cause suicide. There's illness that cause suicide. There are pathological reasons for depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, manic depressive, on and on. So I knew what is depression, what is reactive depression, what is endogenous depression. But, I personally witnessed the death of my grandfather at the age of 6 years. And I had acute depression at the age of 6 years myself, existential, what happens to people after they die. In fact, part of the reason I went to medical school was that, to see why people suffer, why they have suicidal depression. Recently, I've become more interested in what is called existential depression, existential anxiety, which basically almost everybody has at some point. So, at some point, people fear death, they get old, they have infirmity, they feel they're not relevant anymore, or something happens, but at some point, everybody goes through suicidal depression. And not suicide, at some point, everybody goes through existential anxiety and depression. So I became interested in the spiritual aspects of why people have depression, why do they suffer, why some of them so much that they kill themselves or harm themselves. So right now my interest is in existential anxiety, existential depression, its connection to chronic illness, its connection to inflammation, its connection to immune compromised systems and biology. I think it's very difficult to separate mental challenges and separate them from biological challenges. Mind, body are one, even though we don't think of them as that. So it's a body-mind problem, not just a mental issue. There are physical reasons for depression, and anxiety, and then there are mental aspects to it that cause physical problems. So physical and mental go together in the same way as mind and body go together, same way.
No, completely. Well, I find it fascinating because the numbers that we have now are, and this is prior COVID, so this is prior this existential pandemic that we're experiencing, which is not only pushing us to physical isolation, but also the mental isolation. So prior this pandemic, we were already experiencing a higher rate in suicide and depression, to the point where every 42nd in the world, someone was dying by suicide. And depression was is regarded the third cause of the third disease, worldwide disease. So obviously, now in these times, it can only augment, meaning this can only be an exponential problem that we will be facing now with these new norms of social distancing, physical distancing, and how can we recreate a way of living that will allow us to experience well-being in all ways, despite the new world that we will have to adapt to. Do you have any, I would say, practical tools that will help our audience and people in need who need very tangible aspects to deal with this new world?
Yeah, you mentioned isolation. So isolation also means obviously loneliness and feeling separate. So my interest in the wisdom traditions, particularly Vedanta, and also aspects of Kashmir Shaivism and Buddhism, they all kind of point to the same thing, and that is ultimately suffering comes from a few factors that we are totally unaware of, and that the first one is feeling isolated, separate, the separate mind. The separate mind, which is a socially induced hallucination to begin with, because the separate mind is the ego mind, and now all our culture is focused on magnifying the importance of our ego identities. We're essentially becoming a narcissistic society with Instagram, social media, movies, entertainment, etc. Even our heads of state are ultimate narcissists. So if you look at the wisdom traditions, they say this is the true cause of all suffering, that we feel isolated, we feel separate, and as a result, we feel we have to prove how lovable we are, how good we are, but there's never enough of that. So not knowing your true self is the number one cause of all anxiety and all depression, because most people don't know themselves. They know only their ego or identity or their self-image. In other words, they've sacrificed their self for their selfie, as I like to joke. The selfie is your self-image, which is constantly in need of approval, trying to control, addicted to security, addicted to power, addicted to sensation, and it's never enough. That's the first cause. The second cause is that we're trying to grasp at ephemeral, evanescent experiences that are over as soon as they're born. And so, there's a clinging and attachment to experience, and that's never enough either. And then the third is recoiling from anything that's unpleasant, because that's a natural tendency. The fourth is what we just spoke about, confused identity, which is basically the major cause of suicide, confused identity. And the last is actually the fear of death. And paradoxically, people escape that fear of death by committing death. It's very interesting, the dynamics of this. Now, having said this, there are some very acute situations, like a manic episode or a psychotic episode or a schizophrenic episode, where there's immense benefit from pharmaceutical intervention in the acute phase, then address the other phases. But I think where we are right now, we have to address everything. Social isolation doesn't mean it's physical distancing, but you can be more intimate. In fact, loneliness and solitude are two different things. You can be lonely and separated from all the world, and you can be in solitude and connected to all the world. In fact, that's what we should be doing right now. As you and I are speaking right now, using this technology. But this technology can create social networks, as you're doing with Never Alone, the whole campaign of creating global communities, the idea that we can support each other through attention, affection, appreciation, acceptance, but also other ways by offering resources, financial help for those who need it, and those who need it can request it. Those who are able to give it can say they can give it. We can help people find jobs. We can help people with techniques to improve self-esteem. We can help people feel loved till they find that they are lovable anyway. So I think the Never Alone campaign, along with the film that you produced, should be able to act as a catalyst to bring people together. You know, in the wisdom traditions, particularly since I know you're also Buddhist, they say take refuge in the Buddha, which means expanded consciousness. Take refuge in the Dharma, which is higher purpose beyond your skin encapsulated ego's demands. And that's take refuge in the Buddha, take refuge in the Dharma, and take refuge in the Sangha. And the Sangha is the community that hopefully we are creating with Never Alone.